Hi everyone, it's Ben here. We're back again today doing another video. And the subject of today's video is going to be on the least deserving MVPs of all time in the NBA. I'm just going to be going from 1990 to present. If you can think of other MVPs you think are undeserving of winning the award, leave them in the comments below. They can be from 1990 to present or prior to that. These are just some that I picked out that I think stand out as um, being people who maybe did deserve to win MVP, but it is debated as to how much they deserved it. And, you might disagree with some of these, you might agree. I'm not necessarily saying that they shouldn't have won. I'm just saying that like the race was super close and it's very often debated that somebody else should have won the award. So, first off, we have Magic Johnson in 1990. Just to go quickly, I'll have their stat splits, their team record that year, and then sort of like what their narrative was, or like uh, what was kind of the story behind why they should have won MVP, which I think every person needs. Everybody who wins MVP kind of needs that like story behind what they did that season and why they should win. It's a pretty big factor. Um, so this year Magic Johnson won, but Charles Barkley actually got the most first place votes. As far as stat splits, it goes points, rebounds, and then assists. If you're wondering like what 22, 7, 11 means, it means 22 points, 7 rebounds, 11 assists. So if you look at these three guys, statistically speaking, Michael Jordan is definitely the most dominant. Team record-wise, Magic Johnson is definitely the most dominant. As far as narrative, Barkley had a really good season and had kind of carried this Sixers team that had been in the mid 40s for wins for most of the time he'd been there, up to 53 wins, and I think they were the third seed. So that was his story. Jordan didn't really have like a narrative, so to speak. It just was that he was really statistically impressive this year. And Magic probably had the best story in that it was the first year without Kareem, and the team I think still led the West in wins, and I think might have still had the best record in the NBA actually. So people were really impressed by that, and really impressed that he was doing it without his partner in crime, Kareem. So Magic won, but it was pretty close amongst these three. Next, I have Hakeem Olajuwon winning in '94, and you might think that this is surprising, but um, the other main guys here were David Robinson and Charles Barkley. And Charles Barkley had a good argument in that he was kind of trying to do a redemption arc from losing in the finals the year before. But I think the thing that hurt him as far as winning MVP was that he had just won it the season prior. So people kind of were like, okay, Barkley, we gave you your MVP. Maybe if you would have won the title, we would consider giving it to you again. But um, people didn't really know if he deserved a second one. And his stats took a big fall off from the previous year as well. He went from averaging 26 points to 22, from 12 rebounds down to 11, and his efficiency was a bit worse. But he was in it because his team was really solid as far as their record. I believe they were the 2 seed in the West, if I'm not mistaken. I believe the 2 seed or the 3 seed. David Robinson was in it as well, just because his stats were really impressive. He led the league in scoring, also put up 5 assists a game and 11 rebounds, which are really solid for a center. And the team record was pretty close to Hakeem's as well. Hakeem probably had the best narrative, though, being that he was on the best team in the West in the very stacked Western Conference, and he had no other All Stars on his team at the time, but yet they still led the West, which was something that no other superstar was really doing at this time. Robinson won as well, but the Rockets still had a better record, so that really helped Hakeem. But again, another very close season, and these dudes all stood out as the main MVP candidates. Next, we have 1999 Karl Malone. This was during the lockout season. Um, if you look at between Malone, Duncan, and Alonzo Mourning's stats, they're all pretty close. Karl Malone has a bit of an edge in scoring compared to the other two. Duncan and Mourning have better rebounding numbers, but then Malone again has slightly better assist numbers. The records are pretty close, obviously, for Duncan and Malone having the same record. And Alonzo Mourning had the best record in the East, and that was really his narrative, so to speak, for that year, was that He led the Heat to the best record in the East, and I believe was Defensive Player of the Year as well, so that boded well for him. As far as Duncan's narrative, it was really just that he was the best player on a team tied for the best record in the West, and he was only like 22 at the time, which is really impressive. And Malone's narrative was just that he was like statistically very dominant on the best team in the West at like age 36, which people really didn't expect him to keep up that level of play. So this was a year where it was really hard to determine like who to give MVP to, and Karl Malone just probably had a slight edge as far as stats, and doing it at such an advanced age really impressed people, along with leading the West in wins. Next, we have Allen Iverson in 2001. um, and Iverson is considered like an iconic MVP. This is considered an iconic season, but when you look at his team record, he won 56 games in a very watered down East. People often give him a lot of credit because he did it with a very poor 76ers team. A team that, if you put anyone else besides Iverson on that team, they probably win like 45 games, but with him, they won 56 and led the East in wins and got to the finals. Um, Statistically, Shaq was a lot better than Iverson, putting up basically the same amount of points, nearly the same amount of assists, and then obviously way more rebounds. Um, and Shaq was way more efficient in doing it as well, I should add. And his team actually had the same level of success, 56 wins, in a much tougher conference. Um, this is a conference where you had the Chris Webber, Peja Stojakovic, Mike Bibby Kings. You still had the Portland Trailblazers as a threat. You had the Mavericks coming on as a threat. You had the Timberwolves as a threat. You had the Spurs as a really big threat. So this was a very loaded West compared to an Eastern Conference where, by comparison, you basically had as your main threats like the Milwaukee Bucks with Ray Allen and Vince Carter on the Raptors, but neither of which were huge challengers to getting to the finals. So Iverson, I would say he didn't really deserve MVP this year, if I'm being frank. I think Shaq should have won it. The next year is 04 to 05. Again, Shaq was the runner-up this year and one of the closest votes in NBA history. Statistically, Shaq put up decent numbers. Nash put up decent numbers. I think really what this year came down to was the narrative, and Steve Nash had more wins on his team, and the narrative was that the Suns improved by 33 wins from the previous season, which was like um, really really impressive. And obviously the Heat improved a lot too. They increased their wins by 17 games, but um, that's not as impressive as 33. And Nash was really the engine of that Suns team, so I feel like that's why he won MVP. Sort of a facet of, as I say there, being the best player on the team with the best record in the NBA. That is a lot of times the reason why a guy wins MVP, and that seemed to kind of be why Nash won MVP this year. O'Neal, his story arc was kind of like redemption for the Lakers trading him away, but just Steve Nash having that 33 win turnaround was really hard to overcome for Shaq to win MVP. But I think it's kind of a coin flip for this year who you think deserved to be the MVP. 05 to 06, Nash again wins MVP, and probably the year where I think he deserves it less. In my opinion, Dirk should have won it this year. And LeBron was also in the conversation too. LeBron probably had the least case for it, and I'll make his quick. It's basically that the team had an 8-win jump from the previous season, and LeBron statistically was the best player in the league this year, putting up 31 points per game, and along with 7 rebounds and 7 assists was super impressive. Dirk, 60 wins, second best record in the West. I believe the third best record in the NBA. His best individual stats he had to date, putting up 27 and 9. Yeah, so he had a really solid case, I think, and he didn't really have any other like major all-stars on his team, so he had a good case of leading a 60-win team, being like the only all-star player. Nash's case was really just that he had better stats than his previous MVP season, and he was able to secure the second seed in the West, even though Amari was out all season. And you might say, how did the Suns get a higher seeding than the Mavericks? Well, it's because back then, if you were in the same division as a team that had a better record than you couldn't be a top three seed. So the Spurs actually had the best record in the West this year with I think 63 wins. And because the Mavericks were in the same division, they had to be the 4 seed because the Spurs were in their division. The Mavericks weren't allowed to be a top 3 seed. So because of that, the Suns got to be the second seed. So the argument for Nash was that he had a better statistical season than the year before, and his team was still able to be the second seed even with his all-star running mate missing the entire year. But to me, this should have been Nowitzki's award. And the last year I'm going to point out is the 2014 to 15 Steph Curry campaign. This one, I think that Steph probably deserves, but it's closer than people think. Stats wise, Curry was a lot more efficient, but James Harden put up some really solid numbers too. Was a better scorer as far as points per game, put up more rebounds, put up close to the same number of assists. Um, the narrative for Curry was really just that he was the best player on the best team in the league this year, and they kind of came out of nowhere and impressed a lot of people, so he got the award. But James Harden actually had quite a narrative this year that you consider he was on a team where Dwight Howard missed a lot of this season, like a little bit over half of the season, and they were still a 56-win team when at times James Harden's like second and third best players on his team were like Corey Brewer and like Terrence Jones. Like let me get this straight. A supporting cast of Patrick Beverly, you got Patrick Beverly, Jason Terry, Corey Brewer, and Terrence Jones. That was like the supporting cast around Harden, and this team was the second seed in the West and won 56 games. And that's a Western Conference with the defending championship Spurs. You've got the Portland Trailblazers. You've got Grit and Grind Memphis, who had their best season this year, record-wise. You've got the Clippers right in the heart of their prime. And James Harden with this band of misfit old bad players. Corey Brewer is out of his prime at this point. Same with Josh Smith. Terrence Jones was like at best a seventh man. Jason Terry was like 39, and they were still giving people work because James Harden was the engine. So there you go, guys. Those are some of my thoughts on some of the least deserving NBA MVPs of all time. If you have additional thoughts, leave them in the comments, and I will see you next time.